Welcome back to the Doctrine Deep Dive. Today we're doing something a little different. We're not just looking at a map. We are looking at the ghosts that haunt it.
That's a really great way to put it.
I mean, you open a newspaper right now, or you scroll through your news feed, and you're just going to see these headlines.
All the time.
Right. The South China Sea, missile tests in North Korea, tensions across the Taiwan Strait. It just feels like the Pacific Rim is this constant simmering cauldron.
It certainly does. And the thing about those headlines is that they often treat these events as if they're happening in a vacuum.
Right, like isolated incidents.
Exactly. A boat colliding here, a military drill there. But they are not isolated at all. They're aftershocks.
Aftershocks of what? Exactly. Because that, I think, is our mission today. We're trying to understand the origin story of the modern Asian security architecture. And to do that, you can't just look at what's happening now.
No, you have to go back.
You have to go all the way back to the messy, complicated, and, well, frankly, the unfinished business of 1945.
Precisely. We're talking about the political legacy of World War II and the immediate onset of what we're calling the Hot Cold War.
Hot Cold War.
Yeah, because the central thesis we're exploring today is that in East Asia, World War II never really ended in that same clean, decisive way it did in Europe. You know, the peace treaties were vague, the justice was seen as flawed, and the shooting started again almost immediately.
So to guide us through this massive topic, we have a stack of sources that is, well, it's a little intimidating. We're definitely not skimming Wikipedia today.
No, this is serious scholarship.
So why don't you walk us through the syllabus for this deep dive?
I would be happy to. And it is a heavy stack, but every single one of these pieces is just foundational if you want to understand international relations in East Asia.
Okay.
So we're going to start with the sort of legal and moral foundation. We'll be looking at Gary J. Bass's extensive review of the book Judgment at Tokyo.
Right, the Tokyo trials.
Exactly. Then, to get a handle on the strategic landscape, we have Richard K. Betts's article, Wealth, Power, and Instability. And, very importantly, we'll be examining M. Taylor Fravel's definitive work on territorial and maritime boundary disputes in Asia.
Which feels incredibly current.
Oh, absolutely. But that's just the geography and the strategy. We also have to get into the history.
Of course.
So for that, we're pulling from John Lewis Gaddis's seminal book, The Cold War, A New History.
Yeah, classic.
It really is. We also have Jennifer Lynn's analysis on democratization and stability in East Asia, and Frank E. Rogers' really detailed study on Sino-American relations and the Vietnam War.
Okay.
And to round out that conflict piece, we'll be discussing Branislav Slantchev's notes on national security strategy, Korean War.
And we have two more that sort of deal with the why of the current situation,
Yes.
right? The psychology of it all.
Yes, exactly. We have Stein-Connison's article, which asks this really fundamental question: what is it that best explains the East Asian peace since 1979?
A piece that seems so fragile.
It does. And finally, a crucial piece on memory and psychology by Zheng Wang, titled National Humiliation, History Education, and the Politics of Historical Memory.
Okay, so you have the reading list. Let's jump right into the deep end. I want to start with a comparison.
Okay.
When we think of the end of World War II in Europe, there's a script we all know. Berlin falls, Hitler commits suicide, the Nazis surrender. Then you have the Nuremberg trials, where the bad guys are punished. Then you have the Marshall Plan to rebuild. It feels like a story with a definite the end and a new chapter beginning.
That is the European narrative, absolutely. It's clean. The line between war and peace feels like it's drawn in ink.
But looking at our sources for today, the Asian narrative seems totally different. It feels like that line was drawn in fog. So why does the source material suggest that in East Asia, the war never really ended?
That is the framing question for this entire discussion. You're right. In Europe, the old powers, Germany, France, Britain, they remained, just in different forms. In Asia, the defeat of Japan didn't just end a war, it shattered the entire colonial system.
How so?
Well, Japan had kicked the Europeans out of their colonies during the war. So when Japan collapsed, there was this massive power vacuum. You had civil wars breaking out in China, revolutions in Vietnam, independence movements in Indonesia. It was chaos.
Okay.
But if we want to find the root of the bitterness that still exists today, we have to start with the attempt to provide justice. We have to look at the Tokyo trials.
And this is where we dig into Gary J. Bass's review of Judgment at Tokyo. I think, most of our listeners know about Nuremberg. We've all seen the black and white footage of the headphones and the solemn judges.
Yes.
But the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo trials, it really gets forgotten.
It absolutely gets forgotten in the West, but it is vividly, and I mean vividly, remembered in Asia. And the differences are just striking.
Like what?
Well, for starters, the timeline. Nuremberg took about 11 months. The Tokyo trials dragged on for more than 2 years, from 1946 to 1948.
Wow.
And the atmosphere Gary J. Bass describes is not one of solemn, swift justice.
No, he paints a picture that's almost chaotic. He describes the judges being penned up in the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, dealing with the heat, the humidity, and these just clashing egos.
It was a pressure cooker. And the personnel were, well, let's just say they were colorful. Bass describes the American chief prosecutor, a man named Joseph Keenan, in very, very harsh terms.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he calls him a blundering alcoholic.
Okay. So not exactly the figure of moral authority you want leading the trial of the century.
Not at all. Bass notes that the British colleagues were just furious. They felt like they were acting as, and this is a quote, inebriate house attendants.
Wow. So they were basically babysitting it.
Yeah, instead of, building a legal case against war criminals. And then you had the president of the tribunal, the Australian judge William Webb.
And what was his deal?
Apparently, he was incredibly short-tempered and clashed constantly with the other judges. The text uses this great Scottish term to describe the whole proceeding, a long collie shangy.
A collie shangy. I love that. It means like a noisy dispute or a dogfight.
Exactly, a noisy dogfight. But beneath all those personality clashes, there was a really profound legal problem.
And what was that?
They were trying to prosecute the Japanese leaders for the crime of aggressive war.
Explain that to us. I mean, we know what war crimes are, torturing prisoners, killing civilians.
Yeah.
But what is the crime of aggressive war?
And that's the sticky part. The prosecution was arguing that the act of starting the war itself was a crime. The problem was that international law at the time was very, very vague on this.
So it wasn't clearly illegal.
For centuries, declaring war was just something sovereign states did. It was seen as a tool of statecraft. Now, at Nuremberg, the atrocities of the Holocaust were so unique and so overwhelming that they provided a kind of moral cement that held the legal arguments together.
But not in Tokyo.
In Tokyo, while the Japanese atrocities were horrific, you have the rape of Nanjing, the legal footing for trying leaders specifically for aggression was shaky.
So how did they get around that?
Well, Bass mentions that the French judge actually had to invoke natural law.
Natural law?
Right. He had to appeal to a higher moral code, written on the human heart, because the actual treaties and statutes didn't clearly make aggression a crime for which you could hang individuals.
And this legal shakiness, this brings us to probably the most fascinating character in the whole Tokyo drama. The dissenting judge from India, Radha Binod Pal.
Judge Pal is crucial. If you want to understand the modern arguments of Japanese nationalists today, you have to understand Radha Binod Pal.
Why him specifically?
Because he was the only judge to submit a dissent that completely rejected the tribunal's legitimacy. He didn't just say the defendants were innocent, he argued the court had no right to even try them.
Wow. And what was his argument based on? It was anti-colonialism, wasn't it?
It was. You have to remember the optics of the situation. You had judges from the United States, Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, all sitting in judgment of Japan.
All colonial power.
All colonial powers. Pal pointed out that these Western nations held India, Indochina, Indonesia by force. He effectively asked, how can you judge Japan for imperialism when you spent the last century doing the exact same thing?
That is a searing critique. It really highlights the whole victor's justice argument.
It goes even deeper. Pal also brought up the issue of atrocities. He acknowledged the Japanese crimes, of course, but he pointed out the hypocrisy of the United States charging Japan with crimes against humanity.
Because of the atomic bombs.
Immediately after the United States had firebombed Tokyo and dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Pal argued that those bombings were the worst atrocities of the war, yet no American was on trial.
So for Pal, the trial wasn't justice. It was just vengeance.
It was vengeance, pure and simple. And Gary J. Bass makes the point that this dissent is still used today. Japanese nationalists treat Judge Powell's dissent like holy writ.
So they use it to justify their own historical revisionism.
Exactly. They use it to argue that the Tokyo trials were illegitimate, and therefore the entire narrative of Japanese war guilt is a fabrication of the victors. It provides the sort of scholarly, legal shield for them.
Speaking of shields, there is one more massive issue with the Tokyo trials. The elephant in the room, so to speak. The one person who wasn't there, Emperor Hirohito.
This is probably the single most important political decision made in the immediate post-war period in Asia. In Germany, the Nazi leadership was decapitated, Hitler was dead, his inner circle was tried, the entire regime was thoroughly discredited.
But not in Japan.
Not in Japan. General Douglas MacArthur, who was effectively running the occupation, made a cold political calculation. He decided he needed the emperor.
He needed for stability, right? To break chaos.
Yes. MacArthur was terrified that if he arrested and tried the emperor, the entire Japanese social fabric would just tear apart. He feared a communist revolution or, endless guerrilla warfare. So he cut a deal.
What was the deal?
The emperor would remain on the throne as a figurehead, and in exchange, he was completely exempted from prosecution. He wasn't even called as a witness.
But just think about the psychological impact of that.
Yeah.
You spend 2 years in a trial trying to establish the truth of the war, but the man in whose name the war was fought is just pretending he was a passive observer.
It created a permanent foundational lie. It allowed the Japanese people to kind of detach themselves from responsibility. The logic went, well, if the emperor, our supreme leader, wasn't guilty, then how can I, a regular soldier or a farmer, be guilty?
It prevented that deep national soul-searching that we saw in Germany.
Exactly. That flawed foundation, as Bass calls it, means the moral books were never balanced. And that is why the history wars are still so incredibly hot today.
So we have a flawed peace and a compromised trial. But as we move into the next part of our discussion, we see that peace didn't even last.
Not at all.
We transition now to Branislav Slanchev's notes and John-Louis Gaddis's History of the Cold War. We're moving from the courtroom in Tokyo to the battlefield in Korea.
This is where the hot Cold War truly begins. And again, we have to look at the power vacuum. Japan had destroyed the old order in Korea, and when they left, the peninsula was divided.
Now, I think the common understanding, the high school history version, is that the Korean War was a Soviet plot, that Stalin pushed a button in Moscow and the North Koreans just marched south. But Slanchev's reading suggests it is much, much more complicated than that.
It is significantly more complicated, and it gives much more agency to the local actors. Slanchev really corrects a major misconception here. The drive for the Korean War didn't come from Moscow. It came from Pyongyang.
So it was Kim Il-sung's idea?
It was Kim Il-sung's initiative, absolutely. The grandfather of the current leader, Kim Jong-un.
Right.
Kim Il-sung was a nationalist and a communist, and he was determined to unify the peninsula under his rule. He viewed it as a civil war. He spent more than a year lobbying Stalin and Mao Zedong for permission and support to invade the South.
So Stalin wasn't pulling the strings. He was actually holding Kim back.
Stalin was incredibly cautious. We have to remember this is 1950. The Soviet Union was still recovering from the devastation of World War II. Stalin was terrified of a direct war with the United States. He knew their industrial capacity.
So what changed his mind?
He only gave Kim the green light when he became convinced that the United States would not intervene.
But why would he think that? I mean, the United States had just fought a world war to stop aggression. Why would Stalin think they would just let Korea go?
Because the United States government practically told him so. And this brings us to what might be the biggest diplomatic blunder of the 20th century.
Okay.
In January 1950, Secretary of State Dean Acheson gave a speech at the National Press Club. In that speech, he was outlining the United States' defensive perimeter in the Pacific.
Right, the famous line in the map.
It is. Acheson verbally drew a line of defense that ran from the Aleutian Islands down to Japan and then to the Philippines.
And he left Korea out.
He left Korea out. He left Taiwan out, too. Now, Acheson's intent was that those areas were the primary responsibility of the United States military, not that they were up for grabs.
But that's not how it was heard in Moscow and Pyongyang.
Not at all. To Kim Il-sung and Stalin, it sounded like a formal invitation. They interpreted it as a green light. The Americans have drawn their line, and we are on the safe side of it. We can attack.
But they were wrong.
They were fatally wrong. When the invasion happened in June 1950, President Truman didn't look at his defensive perimeter map. He looked at history.
He saw it as another Munich.
Exactly. He saw the invasion through the lens of 1930s appeasement. He believed that if he let the communists take Korea by force, it would just encourage them to take more, and that would lead inevitably to World War III. So, despite Acheson's speech, the United States rushed in.
And once the United States was in, Slanchev notes that there was this huge debate inside the U.S. government about how to fight. He calls it the clash between the Never Again School and the Limited War School. This seems like a really important distinction for understanding American strategy ever since.
It is critical. The Never Again School was very popular with many military leaders who had fought in the Pacific. Their argument was simple. The United States should never again get bogged down in a land war in Asia against massive peasant armies. We cannot match them man for man.
So what was their solution? You can't just not fight.
Their solution was technology, and specifically nuclear weapons. Their doctrine was that if you fight to win, and you use every single weapon in your arsenal to destroy the enemy's capacity to wage war.
So they wanted to use the threat of massive retaliation to deter any aggression in the first place.
That was the idea.
Yeah.
But that is not what happened in Korea.
Why not?
Because the Limited War School won the argument. This was the view of the Truman administration and later Eisenhower. They argued that in the nuclear age, the old definitions of total victory were just. They were obsolete.
Because the risk was too high.
The risk was Armageddon. If the United States used nuclear weapons in Korea, it might force the Soviet Union to respond in Europe. It could trigger a global nuclear holocaust. So the United States had to fight a limited war.
Which meant fighting with one hand tied behind their back.
In a way, yes. It meant they had to accept a stalemate. They had to be willing to die for a tie, as the saying went, rather than risk World War III. And that decision to keep the war limited is what froze the conflict. It's why there's still a North and South Korea today.
But the impact of that decision went way beyond just the Korean peninsula.
Oh, it did. The Korean War completely militarized the Cold War in Asia. Before the war, the United States was actually preparing to let the Chinese communists finish their civil war and take Taiwan.
Really? They were just going to let it happen?
They viewed it as basically inevitable. But when the North Koreans attacked, Truman panicked. He thought this was a coordinated global communist offensive, so he sent the United States 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait to neutralize it.
And that single decision is still with us today.
That is the moment the United States committed itself to the defense of Taiwan. That one decision in June 1950 is the reason we are still talking about Taiwan scenarios in 2026. The Korean War created that rigid alliance structure, the hub-and-spoke system, that defines the entire region to this day.
So Korea taught the world the profound danger of miscalculation. But then we move to the next major conflict, Vietnam. We're looking now at Frankie Rogers' analysis of Sino-American relations and the Vietnam War. And there is a real puzzle here.
Okay.
The United States fought a massive, brutal war in Vietnam right on China's southern border. Why didn't that trigger World War III? Why didn't China invade with millions of troops like they did in Korea?
That is the central question Rogers answers. And the answer, in a word, is learning. Both sides had learned their lesson.
The lesson of Korea?
The memory of Korea was fresh and it was painful. Both Beijing and Washington were terrified of repeating that direct clash between their armies. So what you see is this fascinating, almost choreographed dance of signaling.
How does one signal during a hot war? It's not like they had a direct hotline between the White House and Beijing.
No hotline, but they had public statements and they had third-party messages. China was very explicit. They sent signals through various channels that effectively said, here are our red lines.
And what were those lines?
If the United States invades North Vietnam with ground troops, with our own combat troops.
So they were drawing their own defensive perimeter, just like Acheson did.
Exactly, and the United States respected it. Rogers calls this the tacit agreement. American military commanders were constantly asking for permission to invade North Vietnam, to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail, to destroy the enemy at its source.
But the political leadership always said no.
Always. Lyndon B. Johnson and later Richard Nixon, they said no. They were haunted by the ghost of Korea. They knew that crossing the 17th parallel on the ground meant a direct war with China, so they fought a limited war in the South to avoid a total war with China.
Rogers also mentioned something that really surprised me, the Warsaw talks. I had no idea the United States and China were talking at all during the 1960s.
It's a great detail, and it really humanizes the Cold War. The United States and China had no official diplomatic relations. They didn't even recognize each other's governments. But they both had ambassadors stationed in Warsaw, Poland. And those ambassadors would meet periodically in a polite, neutral room.
All while their countries were effectively fighting this brutal proxy war. just a few thousand miles away.
Yes. While American planes were dropping bombs near the Chinese border, these diplomats were meeting to manage the crisis. It acted as a safety valve. It shows that even in the heat of the hot Cold War, there was a mechanism, a desire to prevent the ultimate catastrophe. They were establishing boundaries for the violence.
So we've had decades of just brutal conflict, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. But then as we move into the next part of our syllabus, the whole narrative shifts.
It really does.
We look at Stein-Tonnison's article, and he asks us a very simple but really profound question. What is it that best explains the East Asian peace since 1979?
It's a striking contrast, isn't it? Between 1945 and 1979, East Asia was the most violent, war-torn region on the planet. Millions and millions of people died.
But since 1979?
Since 1979, there's been no major interstate war. And Tonnison argues that this peace wasn't an accident. It wasn't just about nuclear deterrence. It was a choice.
A choice made by whom?
By the leaders of the region, specifically Deng Xiaoping in China, and the leaders of the ASEAN nations in Southeast Asia. They made a fundamental shift in their priorities. They shifted from ideology to economy.
Explain that shift. What does that mean in practice?
Well, for decades, your legitimacy as a leader came from being a revolutionary. You ruled because you fought the imperialists. But by the late 70s, the entire region was exhausted and it was poor.
Right.
Leaders like Deng realized that you cannot get rich if you are constantly fighting your neighbors. It's just not possible. So they changed the social contract. They effectively said to their people, I deserve to rule, not because I am a revolutionary hero, but because I am making you rich. I am delivering economic growth.
So prosperity became the new ideology.
Exactly. And prosperity requires stability. China stopped exporting revolution. They stopped funding communist insurgents in Thailand and Malaysia. The Southeast Asian nations stopped bickering and formed a trade bloc. They all prioritized absolute economic gain over relative status or ideological purity.
And Tonnison calls this the developmental peace.
The developmental peace, that's his term for it.
But not everyone is convinced this peace is going to last forever. We have to juxtapose Tonnison's optimism with Richard K. Betts's article, Wealth, Power, and Instability. Betts seems, a lot more cynical.
Betts is a realist with a capital R. In international relations theory, realism teaches that you should ignore what leaders say, their intentions, because intentions can change overnight.
So what should you focus on?
Capabilities, power. And Betts makes this chillingly simple argument, wealth is power.
So the very thing that Tonnison says brings peace, Betts is arguing brings the seeds of war.
Precisely. Betts argues that the incredible economic growth of East Asia is actually destabilizing in the long run. When a country gets rich, it doesn't just buy better food and infrastructure.
It buys security.
It buys fighter jets, submarines, and aircraft carriers.
And we see that happening right now. I mean, China's naval buildup is historic.
And Betts would say that is completely inevitable. A poor China was internally unstable, but a rich China is a potential hegemon, a dominant regional power. He argues that as China's power grows, it will naturally want to push the United States out of its backyard.
Just like the United States pushed the European powers out of the Western Hemisphere in the 19th century with the Monroe Doctrine.
Exactly the same logic. And since the United States is currently the cop on the beat in Asia, that creates an inevitable collision course.
That's the realist trap.
It is. Betts warns that the United States system of alliances, that hub-and-spoke system we mentioned, has acted as a stabilizer. It kept Japan from rearming. It kept the sea lanes open. But as the Asian nations get wealthier and stronger, maintaining that American dominance becomes incredibly expensive and incredibly risky.
So Betts is asking a hard question. Is it worth it for the United States? And what happens if the U.S. pulls back?
Do you get a new stable balance of power, or do you get chaos? That's the question he leaves us with.
This friction between the economic peace argument and the realist danger argument is just fascinating. But there's a third layer here, and honestly, this feels like the most volatile one of all. We have to talk about what is going on inside people's heads, the memory politics. And this is where Zheng Wang's work on national humiliation comes in.
Zheng Wang's insights are absolutely essential here. He explains why, despite all this economic integration and trade, the anger and the nationalism in the region seem to be getting worse, not better.
So where does he trace that back to?
To understand it, Wang takes us back to a very specific turning point. 1989 and the Tiananmen Square protests, followed by the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991.
That was an existential crisis for the Chinese Communist Party.
An absolute crisis. Communism as a global ideology was effectively dead. The Soviet Union was gone. The party had to answer a very simple, very dangerous question from its own people. If we aren't delivering the communist utopia and we are in democracy, why should you be in charge?
You needed a new story, a new source of legitimacy.
And the story they chose was nationalism. Wang details how the party launched this massive patriotic education campaign in the early 90s. They systematically rewrote history textbooks. They shifted the entire national narrative from a victor narrative to a victimization narrative.
What's the distinction there?
The victor narrative, which was dominant under Mao, said, the Communist Party is great because we defeated the imperialists and the Japanese. We stood up and made China strong. The victimization narrative focuses on the suffering. It focuses on the century of humiliation, from the Opium Wars in the 1840s all the way up to 1945. The message became, the West and Japan bullied, invaded, and humiliated us for 100 years. The party is the only thing standing between you and that happening all over again.
And this wasn't just a few speeches. This was a complete curriculum overhaul.
It was drilled into students from kindergarten all the way to university. And Wayne points out that this created a specific generation, what he calls the patriotic youth.
And who are they?
These are young people who never knew the poverty or chaos of the Mao era. They've only known China's rise. But because of their education, they view the entire world through a lens of historical grievance. They are hypersensitive to any perceived slight against national dignity.
So while Tonneson says the leaders chose peace to get rich, Wang is saying they planted these seeds of anger just to stay in power.
And that is the trap they've set for themselves. The party used nationalism to regain legitimacy, but now they are riding a tiger they can't get off of.
What do you mean?
If the Chinese government tries to compromise with Japan or the United States on some issue today, their own people, this patriotic youth, might turn against them and call them traitors. It severely limits their diplomatic options. It forces them to be hawkish.
We often hear in the West that the solution to this kind of aggressive nationalism is democracy. Democratic peace theory suggests that democracies don't fight each other. But Jennifer Lin's article on democratization and stability throws some very cold water on that idea.
It throws a bucket of ice water on it. Lind looks at the case studies of South Korea and Taiwan. Both of these countries transition from brutal military dictatorships to vibrant democracies. It's a great human rights success story.
But did that democratization make them less nationalistic?
No, in many ways it made them more nationalistic, at least publicly.
Why is that? You would think that free people would choose peace and reconciliation.
Because in a democracy, politicians have to win votes. And in East Asia, playing the nationalist card, bashing the old enemy, is a very effective way to win an election. In South Korea, being tough on Japan is a bipartisan issue. It gets people to the polls.
So Lind is warning us not to automatically assume that a democratic China would be a friendly, peaceful China.
Exactly. She argues that a democratic China could very well be a hyper-nationalist democracy. You might have candidates competing to see who can be tougher on the United States or on Japan. Lind also notes that sorry states, nations that apologize and reconcile, are very rare because apologies are politically expensive. It is very hard to tell your voters, we were wrong. It is much easier to say, they wronged us.
Wow. Okay, so this brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. We've talked about psychology, economy, and history, but we also have to talk about the physical map.
Yes.
This is M. Taylor Fravel's work on territorial and maritime boundary disputes.
And Fravel gives us the hard data to back up all this tension. He points out that since 1945, Asia has had more territorial disputes than any other region in the world. And again, this goes right back to that flawed foundation we started with.
The end of World War II.
The San Francisco Peace Treaty that formally ended the war with Japan was incredibly vague. It stripped Japan of its empire, but it didn't clearly say who owned many of the islands it was taking away.
But why are these disputes so hard to solve? I mean, we're often talking about tiny rocks in the ocean. Sometimes they're completely uninhabited. Why risk a war over them?
Fravel argues it's about sovereignty as a core interest. Remember, many of these states are post-colonial. They're new states. Or in China's case, a state recovering from that century of humiliation. For them, territorial integrity is the ultimate test of legitimacy.
So compromise is seen as weakness.
Giving up even 1 inch of territory looks like weakness. It looks like a return to the days of being carved up by colonial powers. It's an existential issue for them.
Fravel also notes a really interesting shift in where these fights are happening.
He does. During the Cold War, most of the disputes were over land borders, like the high-altitude border between China and India, or the long border between China and the Soviet Union. But in recent decades, the focus has shifted to maritime disputes.
The South China Sea, the East China Sea.
Exactly.
And why is a maritime dispute more dangerous?
Because it's not just about a line on a map anymore. It's about resources. An exclusive economic zone gives you the rights to oil, gas, and fisheries in that water. And it's about strategy. It gives you strategic depth for your navy. Resolving a land border usually just means putting up some markers. Resolving a maritime dispute involves sharing resources and naval control, which is much, much harder to compromise on.
So let's try to synthesize all of this. We have covered a huge amount of ground today. We have a region that, according to Tonneson, chose economic peace just to survive and get rich. But according to Wang and Lind, that same region is armed to the teeth with historical grievances and memory politics. According to Fravel, it has all these unresolved volatile borders. And according to Betts, the sheer growth of wealth is destabilizing the whole balance of power.
That is the synthesis. You have these massive tectonic plates grinding against each other. The logic of economics says, peace is profitable, don't rock the boat. The logic of nationalism says, we were humiliated, we must stand strong, never compromise.
And for the last 40 years or so, the economic logic has won.
It has. Leaders like Deng Xiaoping made sure of that. They kept that nationalism on a leash, using it when they needed it, but not letting it drive the bus.
But the generation that made those decisions, they're gone.
Exactly. And that is the final provocation I want to leave with you, the listener. The East Asian peace held because the people in charge remembered the horror of war and they desperately needed economic growth. But now we have a new generation of leaders and citizens.
And they're different.
They are richer, they are more powerful, and thanks to things like the patriotic education, they are angrier.
So the question is,
will the need for continued economic growth continue to suppress the politics of humiliation? Or if the economy slows down, will those hot memories of the Cold War and World War II finally boil over?
Because the past in East Asia isn't dead?
It isn't even past. It's right there, just under the surface, waiting for a spark.
That is a very sobering thought to end on, but it definitely changes how I look at the map. It's not just a market, it's a minefield of history. Thank you for walking us through this deep dive. It has been a masterclass.
My pleasure. It's always good to unpack these things.
And thank you to our listeners for joining us on the Doctrine Deep Dive. We will see you next time.